G'day everyone, welcome to Lubrication Experts, and today I have a returning guest. Right, it's pretty rare that we get returning guests, but I've got Adam Banks here from Afton Chemical. Adam previously came on the podcast to talk about electric vehicle fluids, and he's back today to, celebrate the 20th birthday of the Dex VI spec, which, as far as like nerdy things go, celebrating the birthday of a spec is like right up there.
Yep.
But nerdy things is what this podcast is all about. So, Adam, I don't know, has your role in Afton changed since the last time we talked?
A little. So Adam Banks, Senior Marketing Manager for Afton Chemical, and I look after automatic transmission fluids for Europe, Middle East, Africa, India.
Awesome. So the right person to talk about this topic and the right person to get excited about such spec changes or lack of changes, as the case may be. We'll find out. So just to get started, I think probably one thing that's maybe not appreciated so much is like what an ATF actually is and how is it distinct from a regular gear oil, right? So the way that, I generally conceive of gear oils, like many things, it splits into vehicle versus industrial. So you've got industrial gear oils, and then you've got your vehicle, in which case most people are probably familiar with the GL specs, GL4, GL5, MT1, SAE, I never get the number right, is it 2360?
Yeah,
okay.
2360, very good.
Cool. And then you've got the ATFs, which kind of they kind of orbit in their own category. You've got the LV and the ULV fluids. So what makes an ATF different from a regular manual transmission fluid?
Friction is the defining characteristic of an ATF. And be that for a step-type automatic, where there are clutches, or for CVT, where there's chains and pulleys, it's the friction that's the biggest characteristic. Now, if you go back further in history, it was ZDP style fluids, so engine oils, that were used originally in the very first automatic transmissions. And that can, a bit like you have in off-road fluids, have friction capabilities. But over time, it got to a point where it met the maximum that those kind of technologies could do. And it was really in oxidation, thermal protection, that sort of area. And so then it moved to what modern ATF is today, which is dispersant anti-wear chemistry. And that's the default style of ATFs today. A bit different from the gear oils you're talking about. Those are based much more on sulfur phosphorus chemistry. And then for MTF, you've got the friction properties there as well that work the synchronizer. But nonetheless, it's a different kind of branch of transmission technology.
Yeah, that's interesting. Just mechanically, I guess the way that I kind of view an automatic transmission as well, because you've got the fluid coupling aspect to it, that's, I guess, kind of acting like a hydraulic fluid in the sense that you've also got the controller below it as well, which also has to function. Does that change at all the fluid properties, or do we just live with whatever viscosity that we're using to protect the gears?
No, that's important. I think more so in how the fluid is put together rather than the additive necessarily. But shear stability, for example, very important for that. And you're right, it works very well as a hydraulic fluid, not only in the transmission, and it's required there, but also it's used in lots of other applications in commercial vehicle. So power steering, for example, ATF tends to get used, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it works very, very well as that.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. So I think most people, when it comes to ATFs and specs, Dexron would be the thing that they think of.
Yep.
And so obviously the reason why we're having this podcast is because it's 20 years of Dex VI, which is a pretty big deal. There's not that many maybe modern specs which would tend to last that long, right? Like I think in diesel engine oils, CK4 was the most recent, and that was 2016. Okay-ish, right? And even then, so 9 years on, we're already talking about the next spec change is incoming. So 20 years is a pretty big deal. Take us back to the start of Dex VI. Like, where did it come from? Why was it needed? All that sort of stuff.
Yep. So you could look at Dexron VI, and that had established a lot of modern ATF style performance. And in absence of the likes of API, ILSAC, ASEA. There is no kind of industry body that ATF has. There's nothing with those coordinating groups. So Dexron is a brand of General Motors, of course, but it has still become almost like a proxy for quality levels among ATFs. So yeah, Dexron 3 was there, and it was and remains sort of a benchmark specification. However, GM was seeing some issues. They wanted to improve the quality of their transmissions and the longevity and the problem rate. And so they set about improving that, both for the transmission and also for the fluid that was in it as well. So we jumped Dexron 4 and 5 and hit Dexron 6. It was a full-on development effort. In fact, there's an article we've written in Lubrication Experts recently about the history of that. So quite an intensive development. Actually, it's somewhat different when you're developing directly with an OEM. So if you think about the kind of committees that happen with engine oil development, the tests are developed over a long period of time. Everybody has to agree them. And then, yes, there's competition to try and get the most efficient way to deal with that, or the best way to deal with that. But if you like, all of that's agreed. If it's a single OEM and they want to see improvement, it stays flexible till right to the end of the competition. And they can really drive that performance in quite an intense way. And that was the way it happened with Dexron 6. So it's quite intense as competition. And Afton was a big part of that. In the end, we were the first to be validated, so ours was the first in the first Dexron 6 fluid. And yeah, there was an intensity to that development that came through. And I think that then gives a hint as to why it's got the good longevity that it has now.
Yeah, I was going to say, is that why we basically haven't seen Dex 7, or if you followed the pattern, I guess the next one would have to be Dex 9, right?
Yeah, I mean, it partly named for the number of speeds that came along at the time. So it was when the 6 speed came out, and so Dexron 6. I don't know if that was the full decision, but it matched at the time. So given that we're now at 9, 10, 11 speeds, then it'd be beyond that. But I think probably we've capped out maybe on the number of speeds.
Yeah, at a certain point, like if you have an infinite number of these like gear sets, effectively is a CVT, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Maybe one of the things I think was interesting that we've talked about in the past was looking at almost like, because this is a consumer category, it's driven by consumer behavior, which makes it very different from a lot of the fluids that certainly I deal with on the industrial side.
Sure.
And the way that the way that consumers, let's say, drive their vehicles and their purchasing patterns can also be cultural. Yeah. So maybe can you help us understand maybe like regional differences in the way that transmissions have kind of developed? I know that some have kind of lagged a little bit in terms of transitioning from manual to automatic.
Yep.
Certainly over here in Europe, it feels like there are more manual transmissions than, say, you would see over in the US, where to drive stick is becoming like an outdated thing. So maybe, can you talk a little bit, because you would see them at a global level. What are some of those differences?
Yeah. So I think the US is an interesting one to look at. In fact, if you look at adoption of automatics versus manual by different countries, you see a very similar pattern in many countries. So it's like any adoption. We might have spoken about this with the EVs, where you get this sigmoid curve, an S shape of adoption. And so in the US, it was invented, the hydromatic transmission by GM in the 40s. And over the period of 20 to 30 years, it went from a technology coming in to 90%. Maybe there's a slight dip in the 70s oil crisis, back down again. But apart from that, 90% or above automatic transmissions in the US. And it's sat there, in fact, steadily risen a bit since then, squeezing out the last 10. You see that also with other regions with economic development. So you saw that happen, this S shape, over the period of about 20 years in Japan in the 70s into the 80s. And then you see it in Korea in the 90s, where the adoption goes from very little up to 100%. So it really fits with economic development. China is just reaching near 100% now. If you look at India, you can see them just starting to peak up. So they're starting to move. The one weird, different one is Europe, where we've stayed stubbornly at about 10%, which I think is BMWs and Mercedes, execmobiles rolling around with automatics, until a certain point in time. And then, so we stayed at 10% for a really long time until about 2005 to 2010. And then you start to see this inflection coming. Now, a big part of that has been dual clutch. So dual clutch transmissions, and VW introduced that in the early 2000s.
I remember my mate having a dual clutch VW Golf.
Yep.
And it being like quite a big deal at the time. Well, it was his little Golf GTI that we used to flog around the back streets. But
most of the time you don't have branding on transmissions, but VW made a thing of it. DSG on the back of the car and everything. And so it really was more of a push, but it seemed to fit culturally with the European driving style and the European cultural preferences. So if I were to have big swathes of generalization here, which is dangerous, about cultures, so the US like it to be comfortable and smooth. So if you took a European and put them in a US car, they'd say, why is it so unresponsive? Why is it so lazy? And they go, no, it's smooth and comfortable. And you put somebody from the US in a European car and they go, why is it so jerky and twitchy? No, it's responsive. And so you get these different preferences and feel. And you start to see that in the preferences of what people buy and what the car makers are putting out. If you go to Japan, they'd like to have a robot do it for them. And so CVT works brilliantly for them. And here in Europe, the big thing is being connected to the road, to be feeling like you're driving and in control. And so the dual clutch is much more like a manual in that it feels like you're connected, like you're in control and you're driving. Now, over time, the quality of the step-type automatics with the fluid coupling on the front has gone from smooth and lazy, which suits the US preferences, to having enough speeds that it can be more responsive. So the gap has probably closed a bit, but nonetheless, you see that typically the consumer response of dual clutch in the US has been they really don't like it. It's too jerky. It doesn't creep well. And in Europe, CVT is really not popular by consumers. One anecdote is apparently when Audi introduced a CVT, the feedback from customers was such that they programmed in steps into the CVT. What's the point in that? But it's just really disliked by the consumer style. Now, I think that also gives us some clues then about, so you can see why it's changing over. And that tells us a few things about the market and how that's changing. So moving from manual to automatic, and typically places don't go back. So Europe now is about 70% sales of automatic, and it's only going one way. And Australia, what are we at with that? I mean, that's
Yeah, it's pretty high. I think, automatic transmissions are probably, again, I think the adoption curve might have looked a little bit more similar to Europe than it did to the US, but we are predominantly, people who are getting their licenses today are generally doing so in automatic transmissions.
Yep.
And I think now, potentially even to drive a manual, you might actually have to go and retake your test in a manual transmission car.
Okay.
I can't remember what the rules are around it now, but yeah. So, if you've got that sort of slower adoption, how does that then affect things like the ATF formulations? Because I imagine, say for example in the US where you've got a really sharp cutover, everyone goes from using manual transmissions very quickly to adopting auto, that then maybe the adoption of certain automatic transmission specs might kind of mirror that. How does that look?
Sure. So I think it's more the way the lubes industry is built anyway in the US that they tend to move from one spec to the next. In Europe, a lot of the automatic transmissions, at least, have been used in commercial vehicles. So as we were talking about earlier with power steering or secondary hydraulic like cab lifts or any other hydraulic systems you'd find on a truck. And so there's that big volume sat there. So the lubes industry is used to having, I've got a Dexron VI with some approvals from ZF and MAN and others in my catalogue. that works for passenger cars, doesn't it? Well, it probably works for the few old Mercedes that were running around that where it's applicable, but it doesn't reflect the modern ATF. And like you said earlier, it's 20 years. I regard Dexron 6 and the 6-speed as the start of modern ATF in a sense, and that's what we should be selling. So it should be for passenger cars, modern ATF, be that step-type transmissions like with Dexron 6, or a DCTF, or a dedicated CVTF, and that the friction needs of those are each quite different. So you've got to get the right kind of product for your transmission.
Yeah, and I guess manufacturing methods and precision and all that sort of stuff has come a long way in the last 20 years, right? So to be using a spec that's in excess of 20 years old is probably not going to be appropriate, right?
Well, there is one thing with that, which is that, and this connects in with something we might talk about of licensing, where the specification does evolve slightly over time, and if you stay up to date with it, which a licensed fluid guarantees that you do, then you are automatically then covered for any changes in materials or manufacturing precision, as you say. So the tests do evolve just slightly. Maybe it's the limits or the materials involved in it changes over time.
So maybe that's a good segue into talking about specs, because anywhere else, I feel like someone like API, JSO, ASEA, even SAE would have stepped in by now and created a kind of a universal spec, right? So let's say, for example, with the gear lubricants, we had what API is responsible for the GL, and then you've got SAE stepped in with the 2360. Motorbike seems to have defaulted to JSO. You got API and ASEA. You would have thought that automatic transmissions are now like wide enough in terms of their adoption that one of those bodies would have kind of stepped in. Is it just that Dex 6 has been kind of good enough? Like, what made it the de facto standard?
Yeah, I mean, there are others.
Yeah.
Mercon from Ford
Yep.
is another important one. And then JSO did have published specifications. Now, they don't have any kind of approval process. They published it, I think, almost like an academic paper. So you can get it on SAE, a couple of different viscosity grades. But it's broadly in the same performance levels as Dexron 6 or Mercon LV. There have been efforts over time. So I think there was a abandoned consortium that US car that looked at it, but they couldn't get the automakers all to agree. And particularly it was around friction, where the agreement was hard to get to, which rigs, which test methods, what's the precision. And so it's never happened. So for good or for ill, that's where we are. And that leaves you in a position where there are no approvals apart from the licensing that you can get for Ford and GM. So justifying claims in the aftermarket, if it's not the genuine oil, is something that a lot of our customers are interested in. But anywhere you don't have that kind of structure around it, there's a danger that you could, that less scrupulous players could come in and a fluid could be marketed with all these claims in the world, but actually not the support behind it. So there's definitely something to be done to keep rigor in the market.
So you spoke about the licensing system. How does that work? Because let's say, for example, I open a spec sheet and I'll see, let's say, Mercon ULV, right, or Dexron 6. What does that actually mean? Like what has happened in the background to be able to write that on there? And are there different ways of writing that on a spec sheet?
So the two notable licenses are Ford and GM. So Dexron 6 and Mercon LV. And you can get licenses for those as a fluid blender. And what that means is that you can write those, which are trademarks, on your can, and you'll get an approval number written on them as well. So if you see a fluid, you should be able to see the license number on it. So that gives you the ability to make that claim. So Ford and GM, to a greater or less degree, do police those. And they check up that if you've got a license number written on your can, that you are putting in the right stuff into it. And that's the process. So you're kind of listed at that point. There's some yeah, there's a
So what
testing.
if I put Dexron 6 but no license number?
Then if you were buying, well, if you were a customer of that fluid, then you might want to question whether they have a license or not.
Right. So that would be more like one of those suitable for use kind of
Correct.
claims, right?
Which, I mean, maybe you have the data for it and you're comfortable that that meets that performance, but how would your consumer know whether that's the case or not?
Okay.
We've done some focus groups over time, where we talk to installers, and a lot of people don't know what Dexron 6 is. They don't know. They maybe heard of Dexron. You see online on forums Dextron all the time. You know,
Yeah.
there's not a high level of knowledge about it. But what they do say is, I want to know that I'm putting the right stuff in. You know, installers generally want to do the right thing. And if you push them, they say, okay, well, how do you know that it's the right stuff?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I want somebody to have checked it. Okay, who's the right person to have checked it? Well, ideally the manufacturer, that would be good. Okay, what if more than one manufacturer has checked it? You know, in the case of Ford and GM. Oh, great, I'd pay more for that. So there's definitely a desire for that among installers. So that's kind of part of the value of it. And it's having the OEM having said, yep, that stuff's good, that there's some value in that.
So you mentioned that like the licensing system also accounts for adjustments over time, right? So like Dexron 6 is not a static spec, it kind of evolves over time. That kind of points us to the future of ATFs as well, right?
Yeah.
So what are some of the changes that are being made? Like, let's say, for example, if I could compare Dex 6 today to what it was 20 years ago, what are some of the major changes that you would have seen?
They've been modest. So if you compare Dexron 3 to Dexron 6, then there were big changes at that time, 20 years ago.
So what were the major changes there?
So a lot around friction durability. So it was intended to last at least twice as long. Shear stability and oxidation goes into that as well. It's probably the friction durability that was really the defining characteristic of it. And so if you look at GM have a particularly severe test called the cycling test, which is part of the Dexron 6 specification. And that was one that they really pushed up the performance on.
So when you say the friction durability, so we've got, in ATFs, we've got friction modifiers,
Yep.
which are used weirdly to increase the amount of friction most of the time, right? In, let's say, in boundary contact, which is usually the opposite of what we're trying to achieve in a lot of other fluids, right? So we're increasing the amount of friction, and we are wanting to make sure that we have that high level of friction over a long period of time. Is that what you're meaning by friction durability?
Yeah, exactly. So maybe to add a bit more meat to the bones. So the chemistry is designed to push up the friction level, but then shape it for each engagement. So that means that you get a good engagement with the clutches or the torque converter clutch, but then it's smooth. So there's no kind of vibration and harshness over time, either on the initial engagement or as it finally locks.
Yeah. Which would be the judder that sometimes people experience.
Exactly. And so that's what you're trying to have, but you want that at the start of the fill and you want that at the end of the fill 100,000 miles later.
Yeah.
And so that's the durability part, that you want that same profile on the engagement every time. And so that durability is the key part that sort of really came on. Beyond that, it's little shifts. So I say little, but for example, if there's different friction material or there's some view around electrification and that these are suitable for that. So it just maintains that with new materials.
So, and then with Dex 6, is it presumably backward compatible to the transmissions that have come before?
Yeah,
as well?
and very explicitly from GM side on that, and it's back compatible to all previous Dexrons.
Okay. Maybe what's like the next frontier?
Yeah.
In like ATFs.
So I think the first thing to say is Dexron 6, 20 years old, but it's still got a future.
Yeah.
I think it will carry on going. It's been successful and has lasted the test of time because of that kind of intense incubation that it had. But certainly there's specifications that have gone past that already. And so looking at the viscosity is the big thing. So moving to ultra low viscosity fluids. So Dexron 6 and then the LV fluids were between 7 and 6 centistoke, or 6 and 7 centistoke. There are ATF fluids now at 3.5. It's at KV100. So we've come down a long, long way. And at the moment, it's questionable how back compatible those will be.
Maybe just for reference, because a lot of people won't kind of map on to something else.
Yeah.
Right. So 3.5 KV100. What does that compare to? Let's say, for example, if a standard gear oil is like a 75W90.
Yep.
How much lower are we talking compared to that?
So you're testing me now. Is that about 11 centistoke KV100?
Yep.
I think something like that. So if that's 11, traditional ATF is around 7.
Yep.
And then this would be 3.5. So where does water sit at room temperature? It's that kind of area, isn't it?
So that's interesting because I mean now what we're talking about is a gear oil viscosity which is so low that it would be below what, like the lower limit of the SAE grades is 65, because below that, once you get to 60 and below, it's considered like it's the overlap with the engine oil numbers.
Well,
right.
One update in the last year or so since we last spoke, is they've SAE have introduced in that gear oil scheme new numbers to deal with particularly ETFs, so the electric transmission fluids. So now they're going lower and lower and lower.
Yeah, interesting.
So typically the ATFs aren't classified in that way because it's all around what the OEMs want to do. So it's just the KV100 number and a specification. But yeah, it gets into that kind of territory.
Wow. So what are the challenges mostly with, like, obviously lower viscosity, technically less protection, for want of a better word. But what are some of the other technologies on the OEM side which are enabling those low viscosity fluids?
Yeah. So there is some benefit just from changing from fluid A to fluid B and getting the benefit, but there are developments in parallel. So hybridization is a big one. So all of the OEMs have versions of their transmissions with an electric motor included as part of that system. The evolution of those. Some are looking at dedicated hybrid systems, so that really optimizes around when you've got you've got the electric system in place. So, for example, you can remove reverse gear. You don't need that. You can just use the electric motor to do that. That's one example, but as you were talking about earlier, in terms of refinements and tolerances and things, it comes down when you do that. So I think it's an evolutionary process rather than anything that's a big step change. But we are still, by the time you get from the start to the end, you've made a big change.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. Okay. Well, thanks so much, Adam. I think that was really illuminating. Like, I, to be honest, did not know much about Dex 6 coming into this discussion. I feel like I know a lot more. So hopefully everyone in the audience kind of got something out of that as well, because ATFs, like I said, are one of those things where it kind of just hangs out there and no one seems to really know a whole lot about them. So thanks for Adam for coming to educate everyone.
Thank you very much, Rafe.
All right. Cheers. We'll see you for round three at some point.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks.